Hello, everybody. Welcome to Writer's House on this very cold day. I'm glad you're all here for this conversation with the extraordinary Buzz Bissinger and John Prendergast. Can you help me start by welcoming them with a big round of applause? It's always exciting for us to welcome alumni to Writer's House, to welcome them back to Writer's House. I hope that you all feel that this is your place and that you come back often. We love seeing you once a year, twice a year, and every day, for those of you who are here every day. And some of you are. It means a lot to us. This is a big community. This is a special place. I'm glad you're all here. But so today what we're doing is we're going to have a conversation. John and Buzz will talk together for a little while. We'll open it out to questions from all of you. We do have this cordless mic, and that is both so we can all hear the questions and also for the recording. We are recording this, so ask good questions for the recording. And then afterward, we'll have a reception open to all. So I hope you will stick around for the very end when we can gather. We can have some wine. We can have some cheese. It'll be really delicious. John's going to introduce Buzz, but I thought I would introduce John. Many of you probably know him. He's a 1980 graduate of the college. And he's a longtime editor of the Penn Gazette. I was trying to figure it out. 3 decades?
No. God.
It seemed crazy.
More than 2.
More than 2. Between 2 and 3. Yeah, I mean, I knew it was more than 2. The Penn Gazette, it's an amazing magazine. It is really good. Its stories are diverse. They come from everywhere. It's rich. It's full of people and places. I mean, it really has to be. I think Penn is a diverse place full of rich stories, people coming from all over, places. So the magazine has to be and is really nimble. John himself has written about vertebrate paleontology, dinosaurs, novelists, John Edgar Wideman, for example, jazz critics, environmental scientists, college admissions, which is kind of a naughty topic, Knotty. Memoirists, architects, and more. And his writing shows, I think, a genuine interest in people. He's really interested in people. And so he's perfect today to help us know this person who is a great friend of Writer's House. And we're glad you're both here. So please help me welcome John and Buzz.
Thanks a lot, Jessica, and thanks, Writer's House, as always. This is a terrific place and a treasure at Penn, and by the crowd here, a lot of people know that. I am very happy to be here and have the opportunity to talk with Buzz, who is among, I'm going to read a little bit from the bio here, is among the nation's most honored and distinguished writers. Winner of the Pulitzer Prize, the Livingston Award, the American Bar Association Silver Gavel Award, and the National Headliners Award. He is the author of the highly acclaimed nonfiction books Friday Night Lights, A Prayer for the City, 3 Nights in August, Shooting Stars, and Father's Day. We've been fortunate at the Gazette to have the opportunity to run excerpts from 2 of those books. One of them was A Prayer for the City, when Buzz and Ed Rendell and David Cohen were a lot younger, but no less good looking. And we also ran an excerpt, which was not on the cover, but probably should have been, from Father's Day, which is just a wonderful and beautifully and deeply reported memoir by Buzz about his relationship with his son. His first book, Friday Night Lights, has sold, the last figure I saw was more than 2 million copies, so I guess still less than 3 million. And was of course the basis for a film and a highly regarded TV series. For the 25th anniversary edition, Buzz included an afterword where he traveled back to the town that the book was set in and re-met a number of the players who were at sort of the heart of that story. He's a contributing editor at Vanity Fair and has written for many other magazines as well. And at Vanity Fair, the subjects of his stories have ranged from Serena Williams to Bradley Cooper to the tragic story of the racehorse Barbaro to Stephen Glass, which some people might remember as a Penn alumnus who became famous for making up stories. So Buzz was angry with him. Shattered Glass, his article was the basis for a movie about that incident. And he also, in 2015, wrote a cover story for Vanity Fair about Caitlyn Jenner, which received a lot of notice and is a terrific and incredibly well-reported story as well. He is now, for the last, I'm not quite sure how long.
I think 5.
5.
5 years?
5 years?
What are you talking about?
I was about to say you've been working on a new book.
Oh, no, teaching it.
Oh, my God, good. Okay, he is also a teacher at
Oh,
Penn,
sure.
and it has been about 5 years that he's been teaching. He is working on a new book, which I had the opportunity to read a little piece of, and of the book proposal. He is in the midst of researching and reporting on it now.
About 2 years.
It's been about 2 years, and I will just say that it deals with the subjects of war and of football, and I will just leave it to Buzz to sort of describe the book beyond that. Its title is The Mosquito Bowl, though.
That's the tentative title.
Tentative title.
You know, a lot of people have asked me, you probably wonder yourself, where do ideas emanate from? I think the first place they have to emanate from is your heart. If you feel something inside you, for me at least, my heart beats a little bit faster. Ideas are really hard to come up with. They're elusive. Often what happens is you get very, very excited, and then you let it sit a day or a week, and then you realize it just doesn't have enough to sustain a book. Books are hard enough to do if you really like the idea, but imagine doing them if you hate the idea. Like the book I did with Caitlyn Jenner, which we won't talk about.
Okay. Cross off that question.
Which I did really hate, actually. In any case, I spend a lot of time on the internet, like all of us. I find it this incredible universe of ideas. I like to bounce around. I have no really random idea of where I'm going. And I don't even know how I came upon this, but I came upon a story about a football game that was played between 2 regiments of the Marine Corps on Christmas Eve of 1944 at Guadalcanal. This was 3 months before Okinawa, which is a forgotten battle, I think, in our annals. Just to put it in perspective, 240,000 people died in 82 days. 125,000 civilians, roughly 107,000 Japanese, and 14,000 Americans. The casualty rate was well over 50%. In any case, these men were part of the 6th Marine Division. And these 2 teams, the 4th and the 29th, were stocked with great college players. 4 All-Americans, 7 captains, including Notre Dame, Texas Christian, Wisconsin, Illinois, Brown, Cornell, coast to coast, because World War II was an equal opportunity employer, unlike today. Everybody served. And my eyes began to kind of open wide. First of all, the idea of a football game, and they simulated it as much as they could. They built a real field out of the parade ground. They enacted goalposts out of coconut. They had marching bands both before the game and at halftime. They didn't wear helmets because that wasn't sort of typical Marine issue football helmets. And the idea that they would play this game really, really intrigued me. One thing leads to another. There was a program, so I knew the name of the players. I was able to research to some degree who did what. But what really caught my eye and what made me decide after much inner turmoil to do the book was, of the 64 men who played in that game, ranging in age from 18 to mid-20s, of those men, 14 were later killed at Okinawa and over 20 were injured. And in every book, at least for me, and this is a return to what I think I do best, which is not personal experience, which is not memoir, which is straight, traditional narrative nonfiction, I haven't done a book like this in 20 years, and I'm now 65, and it doesn't get any easier as you get older. So this may be it for me. But I felt that game, those men, that could be used as your glue, as your core, as your spine to write about many, many things, including football. Obviously, I like to write about sports and sociology. The Navy considered football to be the single greatest source of training for combat. They believed in it implicitly, and basically the Navy, through officer training programs and through the establishment of actual football teams on Navy bases, kept college football alive. The Army thought football was a crock of shit. So the fact that they were playing football, and you could argue, and actually argue it pretty well, that football, what is really ingrained into the American culture? In many ways, it's war and football. And certainly sports and war are really the only two avenues that existed then where men could express true love to one another. So from there, I think there's a way also to write about battle, to write about war, to write about horror, to write about bravery, to write about heroism, to write about cowardice, to write about napalm, which was, by the way, was invented at Harvard in 1942. To write about all sorts of aspects of battle that affected these men, whether they lived or whether they died, that perhaps we don't think about. Ego, infighting, publicity, landing crafts, insects. The greatest fear of the American military probably was the mosquito. The mosquito caused more more casualties than anything in combat until they invented DDT. DDT finally got rid of malaria. Incompetence. The commanding officer of the forces on Okinawa was a good old boy choice. He was incompetent. He had no combat experience. He did something which was very difficult, not to be dismissive. He ended up getting himself killed. He was the highest ranking officer ever to get killed in combat. The 27th Infantry of the Army, which was the old New York National Guard, which had been affected by constant cronyism, was also incompetent and constantly placed into the crosshairs of some of the worst battles imaginable. The fights between the Navy and the Marines and the Army, they all hated each other. You would think that there would be the common cause of war, but there was not. There was jealousy, there was competition, and if you were a Marine, you were obligated to steal as much as you fucking could from the Army. That was part of your training. So I saw all these aspects. I spent a year on the proposal. For those who are thinking of doing books, you really got to work on the proposal. I spent a year, and I submitted the 20,000 word proposal because I really wanted to be clear in my mind that I really thought there was a book. There are drawbacks. There always are. None of these men are alive. I knew that going in. So there's a lot of reconstruction, a lot of hunting and pecking to try to make them come alive. There certainly are veterans who are alive in their 90s, and I can tell you, if you get to your 90s and you have your marbles, you really have your marbles. These guys are phenomenal, and these are memories that they do not forget. So this is the book that I've been working on, and then somewhat weirdly, in doing the research, my father actually was in the Marine Corps. He was at Okinawa. He never talked about it. Couldn't talk about it. I now understand what he saw. So I never really bothered to research where he was. You know, was he in combat? Was he on the back lines? Was he in the rear guard? So I figured as I was doing research, I said to myself, well, I might as well find out. And as it turns out, he was in combat. He was a rifleman, and he was actually in one of the regiments that I'm writing about. That's not the core of the book. This is not a book of a personal journey of searching for my father. Those books have been done. They're not very good. But it does make me incredibly proud of him, just to know he got off that boat and went on that shore. I still don't know how he did it or how any of them did it, except they did it for their fellow brothers. They didn't do it for patriotism. They didn't do it for the freedom of America. They did it for their brothers. And I've realized that the line between life and death is basically luck. And I've also realized that those who try to be heroic are often the first to die. Those who seek revenge are often the first to die. And for the rest of them, it's getting by, doing your job, and praying that you get what they call the $1 million wound, which was serious enough to get you off Okinawa and back to the United States. So anyway, that's what I've been doing. I find the research endlessly fascinating. It's a complete rabbit hole. I'm ready to start writing, and I can tell because I'm fucking off like crazy. Putting it off, doing a lot of research.
Well, how do you do that? I mean, now I guess there's plenty of written material that exists, but you have been tracking down the different. Is it family members? Is it the men themselves? Is it how
I mean, it's on all cylinders, which makes it daunting. I mean, obviously you want to find out as much as about some of the men that I've decided to focus on, and each of them, there are family members who are alive and they left letters. They left a legacy. They left the documentation of their lives. And the letters, because of censorship, you could not write about the battle. But they're incredibly moving in what they write about, what they think about, the girl back home. Should I have married her? I'm going to be a farmer when I get home. Constant talk about the future, my future, we're coming back. Life is going to be great. I've learned a lot here. I'm now an 18-year-old. He's like a 30-year-old. They just ooze with poignancy, particularly when you know they died. And so there is that corpus of material. There are veterans who remember them. Some of them have left archival material. One of them is from the coal mines of Illinois and was an All-American at Purdue. One's from Wisconsin, and one is from Brown. The other reason I'm doing the book is I found in the course of research that Penn led the nation in football attendance during the war, which is hard to believe because there are probably about 6 people at the game today. But 10. But you do learn all sorts of funky things. My research is not very, I guess, organized. I like, there are great books written about battle. There are great books written about Okinawa. I actually don't read them.
Were you somebody who had read?
I've read a lot about World War II. I've read a lot about World War II, and I'm fascinated by it. I did not read a lot about the Pacific Theater, which was always sort of the second cousin.
Sure.
The more I've read about it, the more horrifying it is, the more incomprehensible it is, the more we as Americans don't quite know the extent of Japanese brutality, including the killing of as many as 10 million Chinese, which people just doesn't register. The use of slavery in Korea, the ultimate brutality of a war that should have been over in 1943. There was absolutely no chance of winning, but their strategy got better as they stayed in the war longer because their only strategy at that point was to kill as many Americans as possible in the hopes that we would come to the table, which we never did. I know there's revisionist theory that we shouldn't have dropped the atom bomb and should have simply blockaded the homelands because the Japanese were in negotiations of trying to get a treaty through the Soviets. If the person country you're trying to get a treaty through declares war on you, I don't think that's a very credible effort. But I like to do things off the beaten track. I like to look at Navy cookbooks. I'm very fascinated by insects. I'm fascinated by landing craft. My goal, and it's a lofty goal, is to try to get inside the heads and the hearts and the minds of those who are on the front lines, to somehow capture the visceral sense of combat, which is not logical, which makes no sense. These guys were the last to know where the hell they were going. War is not linear. War is not chronological, and I don't really. How many here have read military books? I assume a lot. If any of you actually understand one of the infernal maps that they put into those books, which I have looked at and have yet to understand, that's what I want to avoid. I don't care about troop movements. I don't care about company movements. It's the answer to the unanswerable question of how do you do that? How do you survive? How do you live in the conditions under which they survived and lived in a battle that really, among major battles, has been forgotten. 240,000 people dead in 82 days. The civilians caught in a horrible vise between the Americans, who did try to some extent to be humane, and the Japanese, who really had no use for them at all. And 107 Japanese soldiers died. It was the only battle in which there actually were some Japanese who surrendered, which actually would have been the real indication that perhaps they were ready to give up, maybe. But, we'll never know.
Well, this is sort of a little bit off, but I was fascinated, which I had no idea of before, that the Navy, in contrast to the Army, was a strong, powerful believer in football as teamwork, as the ideal training. Did you find anything that would explain why that would be? Because
the
Army has a team too.
The use of war terms in football is now rife. But a lot of the commanders in the Navy played football. It was a seminal experience. MacArthur was in the Army, but he actually didn't play football, but he believed passionately in football. Marshall played football. Nimitz played football. They found football to encourage much of what they felt needed to be encouraged in the military, in the infantry, which was a sense of family, as they believed. Discipline, teamwork, not quitting, not giving up, and violence. Because the game was violent back then. It still is. But it was violence and the ability to withstand pain. And they felt, as I said, that this was seminal in combat. The Army felt it wasn't. And the Army, Gene Tunney, the great boxer who was in charge of physical training for the Army, said the only reason the Navy is doing this is to give fat football coaches an opportunity to keep coaching. But, Army football stayed intact, Navy football stayed intact, and I realized in the course of the research, I could never figure this out. The best teams Army ever had was in 1944 and 1945. They had Blanchard and Davis, who won the Heisman back-to-back. I could not. Why? Well, I found out if you wanted to avoid the draft, the best place to go was Army, because you got a 3-year exemption. And they would recruit that way. They would ask, do you want to go to war and get killed, or would you rather play for Army for 3 years? And most guys said, I'd rather play for Army for 3 years. They recruited from all over the country. They had one player who actually played 7 years of college football. He started at Mississippi State for 2 years. He went to Army for 3 years. He then purposely flunked out so he could play 2 more years. There also was a lot of athletic preference given, at least initially, to the point where George Marshall finally put a stop to it. A lot of athletes, football players, were getting classified as 4F until someone discovered that the University of Tulsa had a football team comprised all of 4Fs that was ranked 4th in the country. So it was seminal in the lifeblood. It even went all the way up to Roosevelt. Henry Stimson suggested that maybe they should cancel the Army-Navy game. It was not worth the cost. It was just, there were other things that were more important. He assumed everyone would agree. Roosevelt said, I can't make that decision. I'm going to throw it into some committee that will do nothing. It's too momentous a decision for me to make. This was the extent to which football was ingrained in the American culture, and I would argue that it was actually during World War II, although a lot of teams weren't playing because there weren't enough men, where football really became embedded in the American soul and embedded sort of as this combat-like, war-like institution that still certainly exists today and really overcame baseball as the true American pastime.
I was struck by some of the letters that you quote from. In some respects, the I don't want to say innocence of it, but sort of the patriotism of it, the feeling like I want to be here, I want to get back, but I want to be here. Which I think, on the one hand, that sounds like a little bit of propaganda, but I mean, it was clearly sincere. There was real. I don't
think it was propaganda. I mean, I think some guys went off because they thought it was an adventure. They were from small towns. It was exciting. The Marine dress blue uniform. Nothing looks better, except you had to rent it and then give it back. It was exciting. It was exciting to get out of North Carolina. It was exciting to get out of Georgia. It was exciting to get out of Western Pennsylvania. There was a lot of machoism going through boot camp until you get over there, and then you begin to realize just what you've gotten yourself into. But they did. They served without question. it was, and everyone says this, but it was a different America. It was an America in which everyone served, including African Americans, were continually treated like shit. The Marines were terribly segregated, but they still served. Women revolutionized the workforce. And the problem was all the men came back and the women had to give up jobs they were much better at, actually. But everyone served. They served without question. That didn't mean they were terrified because they were terrified. But the men, how do you get to know someone who's dead? How do you get to know someone who's alive? It's complex in any situation. But these were great men because they were humble men. They were simple men. They were decent men. They gave unto others. One of the men who died, Tony Bukovich, there was this little 10-year-old boy in Indiana who sent away for autographs from all his favorite players. Well, they all sent back autographs. Can you imagine any football player doing that today? No, he would charge for it. And this one player, Tony Bukovich, said, you know what, let's start a pen pal relationship. And Tony wrote to him faithfully when he was overseas, and this young boy got a return letter that he had sent to Tony, and that's how he found out that Tony had been killed at Okinawa. They were from farming towns, they were from mill towns, they were from mining towns, but they also were from elite Ivy League towns. And to me, one of the great beauties, this was also the last time this was not a have and have not society. It was an opportunity for guys from the South to realize, that guy from Brown, he's a good soldier. That guy from Penn, he's a good soldier. You can rely on him, and vice versa. And they believed implicitly that this was their mission. And some were terrified, some freaked out. Okinawa had over, I think, 10,000 men who suffered what they called shell shock. It has a different name, and there was a lot of empathy for that. Plus, if someone's going crazy on the front line, you don't want them on the front line. There were men who became catatonic. There were men who screamed for their mothers, and other soldiers, Marines would say, you got to shut the fuck up. You're going to give away our location. It rained for 2 weeks straight. There was 25 inches of rain. It was filthy. It was mud. It was lice. It was fleas. It was shit. It was excrement. It was booby traps. But somehow they persevered, and certainly persevered with our amount of materiel, which the Japanese, with great awe, described as the typhoon of steel. When they were up on the banks and they saw the greatest armada of ships in the history of mankind, I forget how many, 400 ships, they couldn't believe it. They also couldn't believe that most of the soldiers were chewing gum, which they couldn't believe because they didn't even know what chewing gum was. And this was also back in the day which every ration had cigarettes. So life has changed. But then the Japanese went underground, could not find them. And it was an enormously successful approach that, as I say, took the lives of 14,000 Americans. It was also the kamikaze. So more military from the Navy died than in any other battle in history.
In an environment like that, or I guess before that all happened, but certainly well into the war, tell the story of how the game wound up getting played. It was two groups were just arguing, right? Is that the?
Yeah, they were. I mean, the military was obsessed with morale. They wanted to keep morale high. Many of these men had been on Guadalcanal, which is not a great place to be, by the way, for months, and they were overtrained. They were bored. They were edgy, and Marines inherently, at a certain point, you want to know: am I going to live? Am I going to die? Am I going to make it? I'm not going to make it. I really, really want to know. And Marines would maintain the Army was very different. I don't give a fuck if I ever get there. So they were looking for ways to improve morale, and these two regiments would argue like crazy over who had the better football team. And finally, the Major General Lemuel Shepard said, "That's it. We're gonna have a football game. We're gonna have a football game. We're gonna have it December 24th. We're gonna call it the Mosquito Bowl. We're gonna broadcast it on the Mosquito Network." All over the South Pacific. Well, there was a group of guys, mostly from New York, who started a radio network in the South Pacific that was quite marvelous, and a lot of it were tape recordings of homecoming shows. They had the Atterbury cocktail hour. Atterbury was what you had to take to stem the effects of malaria. And so they broadcast the game, and there was supposed to be radio silence on ships, and one guy was playing the game, and his commanding officer got livid at him. He said, well, if they're playing a football game on Guadalcanal, the war must be over. Which of course it wasn't. So they play, but to me, the score was 0-0, which I don't really care about. What was serendipitous and beautiful, this was the last time they did something that they loved. It was the last time they could do something with sheer abandon. It was the last time they would remotely be boys again. Because I can sit here and talk about war, but imagine you're 25 years old and you're in charge of 40 men, 20 of whom are either going to get hurt or are going to die. Imagine being 18 years old with a rifle going into a cave and not knowing what's going to be there. This is what these men faced, and they really offset everything with humor, with nicknames. They took nothing seriously because they had to take everything seriously. And so I just felt there were a lot of moves, there are a lot of ways to go. The material is very overwhelming. There are a lot of pitfalls. I was just reading a review of a book, or several months ago, of a book in the London Times by an American author. It said American nonfiction authors have a tendency to write about 200 more pages than they should when they do a nonfiction book. And so I've been thinking about, because as John said, there are a lot of rabbit holes you can go down. But the best barometer for me is I still love the research. I'm still into it, but now it's pedal to the metal. I must get stuff on paper, because until you do that, you don't really know where the holes are, because it's just too easy to get lost. And then the fear is, do I know enough about these men? I know their troop movements. I know where they died. I know how they died. And some of them because of letters, because of going back to their hometowns repeated times. I feel that I'm able to draw a portrait of them. And I think ultimately I decided to do the book. There was pictures. The game was actually publicized at the time. It was written about. And right before the game, there was a picture. They were both, one was in shirts, one was shirtless. That's so they could identify each team. And they were shaking hands. They were so young. And they looked like my dad. And both of them were later killed, Dave Schreiner and Tony Bukovich. And I keep that picture, it's a little picture in my wallet. And they were smiling and they were shaking hands, and 3 months later, they were dead. And now they're forgotten, and so part of this is to keep the memory of them and the memory of other veterans who served alive, because 20 years, 10 years, there won't be any left. And this, I think, will be the last book written about Okinawa, and it's also a cautionary tale about just how horrifying and brutal and unimaginable war is. The inventiveness with which we figure out ways to kill people is beyond comprehension. Anything and everything. To think that we apply such creative, inventive genius to that and have throughout history is terrifying.
Okay. Just to get, if you don't mind, just to get a little flavor of this, maybe just read this little passage. It's just here and then to there. And maybe then after that, we'll just open it up to questions.
Sorry to be so indulgent.
No, please.
Of course, I can't see. I just joined Medicare, so I can't see a fucking thing.
You're home free now.
The nation has had two enduring pursuits, football and war. Never before the Mosquito Bowl, and never since have those two pursuits come together with such heroic and painful virtue. In the aggregate, the 12 who died weren't the most skilled to ever play. They weren't the most talented. They didn't run the fastest or throw the longest or tackle the hardest. But if you measure sports by the values that have since been obliterated, brotherhood, sacrifice of self, dedication, rising above pain, refusal to quit, devotion to others, and an unbreakable knot, values so important that the United States Navy believed football to be the single best training for combat, then these 12 men were the best who ever played. United by the Mosquito Bowl, reunited by the one thing you cannot ever control in war, however brave or heroic or careful or fearful or just trying to survive. Who lives and who dies Robert Frank Bauman from Harvey in Wisconsin, James John Brennan from Flushing and Yonkers High School, Anthony Bukovich from St. David's and Purdue, Robert Lionel DeGreve from Dallas and the University of Texas, Robert Beals Fowler from West Hartford and Michigan, John Hilbert Hebrank from Baltimore and Lehigh, Hubble Kavanaugh Hine from San Angelo and Southern Methodist, Don Lee Jones from Long Beach in Alabama, George Murphy from South Bend and Notre Dame, James Matthew Quinn from Erie and the University of Massachusetts, David Nathan Schreiner from Lancaster and the University of Wisconsin, Edmund Van Order from Ithaca and Cornell. They are forgotten now, as all men in war are ultimately forgotten. They are eternal, as all men in war are eternal. Who they were, what they became, the gung-ho innocence that turned into the darkest heart of horror is not some period piece or contrived cautionary tale, but the most timeless story of all. Humanity in the face that has all become inhuman, the inhumanity of all that once was human, the remarkable sacrifice that men are still willing to make, even when the world has gone mad.
And that was wonderful. And when are you supposed to be finished with us?
Let's see, October of 2062, I think. No, it's tight. I mean, I have to have a fair amount of written it really a year from now. They've gone much, there used to be a lot of latitude on deadlines, but that has disappeared. That's when they want it, and if it's not in some shape by then, they often now cancel the contract, and then you have to pay the money back. Which, but you know, Penn has a big endowment to help me.
That's right, exactly. So I'm just going to open it up then for questions. We have somebody with a mic. Hands. Oh, here we go. Here's one. Okay. Should have two mics, in the front, one in the back.
Thank you. Honor to be here. My name is Stan Green, class of '78. Played basketball here, was a captain, and we got to the Sweet 16 and
Man,
the team
you still
after.
look like you can play.
Yeah,
You're pretty good.
I actually played in the last alumni game.
Did you?
In February. 2 minutes. I got myself in with 2 minutes left to play. That's
cool.
it. But now a co-president of my class, along with my classmate Steve Comite, and been involved in running many companies and so forth. But state, I'm on the board of Penn basketball. We've been approached by someone who wants to write a book about the history of Penn basketball. And the question becomes, and we'd love to get your thoughts around, how do you make it something that would have general interest as opposed to, just chronicling wins, losses, coaches, but what are the opportunities to make something special in something like this?
Well, it's a tricky question, only that you can only tell when you begin to dive in and do the research. I'll be honest with you, it's not going to be easy because it is about Penn basketball, and that's not being dismissive, which does have a great legacy and history. The thing I would try to concentrate on is I would think within the legacy of Penn basketball, there are amazing personal stories. Amazing personal stories that are resonant for all sorts of reasons, probably none of which have to do with basketball. Because basketball is a sport and it's a game, but it's what people are beyond the game that often makes them interesting, and there can be some sort of value of self-help and self-improvement. One of the cool things about sports are overachievers and how people play a game where you think they're not going to be very good, but by will and sacrifice and this weird sense of competition that great athletes have really do rise above themselves. So I mean, that's what I would concentrate on and try to get the best writer you possibly can. I mean, writers can do magical things. I've heard the best ideas turn into the worst books, and I've heard the worst ideas turned into the best books. So I guess I hope my book is the latter rather than the former. But that's what I would suggest, because it does have a profound legacy, and not to be. Then they have to write the shit out of it. They really do. writing makes a tremendous, obviously, difference in how people respond to something.
Thanks.
Sure.
Well, I have another question, which is you had mentioned early on that it had been a long time since you have written this sort of standard nonfiction reporting and research and non-personal. What's the difference? Do you write differently? Do you think about it differently, or is it simply a different content and
Well,
subject?
I used to do it routinely. I used to sort of started at a newspaper in Norfolk, Virginia, and then ultimately the Philadelphia Inquirer, and then went off to write Friday Night Lights. My brain was in that mold. I mean, I feel rusty. I feel nervous. Do I remember, how to do it? The other thing in a book like this is all research. The other books I've done have really been so-called immersion journalism. I've been there. I was there for Friday Night Lights. I was there for A Prayer for the City. So I could see the scenes. I could feel them. I could smell them. I could eat them, which makes things easier to write. When you're writing about yourself, or you're writing, in my case, about your son, in a sense, you're more sure of the material, which has its own problems. I think it's very hard. I sometimes think that personal experience is overrated when you're a writer. I think personal experience is very important as personal experience, but the question of whether you can take your own personal experience and make it into something that resonates and people cares about is a very, very high bar. But I feel out of practice, and in a book like this, there are a lot of moving parts. It's a book that's told in the details. So the need to categorize, to index, to research, to know where things are is somewhat overwhelming and monumental. But I feel, rusty since I wrote A Prayer for the City. I mean, I wrote for television. I wrote for White NYPD Blue. I did talk radio for a while. I went into rehab for a while. I did very, very different things, I guess, out of restlessness and boredom, and now I'm back to what I think is my wheelhouse. And so the anxiety that I feel in actually writing is I think, multiplied. But I'm hopeful that once you get into the rhythm, and I tell my students this, you get into the rhythm, if you find your narrative voice and narrative spine, if you know where you're going, then it can become fun. And then it does become fun. And then you become lit, and then you want to get up in the morning and really get in there. But until you find that moment, it is quite daunting. But as Richard Ford said, it's a hell of a lot better than being a lawyer. And I think he was a lawyer for a while. So I always remember that. His students would complain about writer's block, and he would say, all right, fine, go be a lawyer. And that kind of shut them up.
Okay. Well, I will say thanks very much. Oh, I'm sorry, there's a question.
Greetings, Jasper Jones. My stepfather who raised me was a MacArthur Marine. Did any of those guys become five-stripers?
Any what? I'm sorry?
Five-stripers. You usually get 4 in the Marine Corps.
Right.
But MacArthur was a 5-star general, so some of his guys.
I don't think anyone in the Marine Corps actually was a 5-star general. As a matter of fact, although the Marines, I think you could say without argument that the contribution of the Marines in the South Pacific was beyond exemplary. And actually, at the signing of the surrender on the Missouri, there was actually 1 Marine that was invited. No one else on the top brass was invited. I mean, MacArthur was such a dominant force that he sort of almost sucked all the air out of the room. So there wasn't, as far as you know, there was no 5-striper. No.
And I don't mean this question to be too personal. If you don't want to answer, that's fine. But you mentioned your father and how he either couldn't or wouldn't speak of his experiences in the war. You've met a lot of your dads so far through this project. And I'm really curious if you're willing to tell us, do you now view your father differently? Do you know more about your father? Is there more you want to know about your father as a result of this? And not that you went into this project, well, I'm assuming to learn about your father for other reasons, but the unintended results.
I'm pausing because, yes, I mean, it's made me think about, my dad died 20 years ago, a long time ago. In many ways, he was a very private man. He was very hard on himself. He never really talked about any of his accomplishments. It makes me feel tremendously proud of him, because the people that I've been interviewing were riflemen. They weren't colonels, they weren't majors, they weren't generals. Most of them were privates, like he was. And it's through talking to them, it's in reading that I begin to get a taste of what he went through. And so I begin to wish that I had probed more or asked. I was immensely proud of him, but he seemed to take no pride in it at all, never talked about it. He did mention that the only thing he wished he had had when he was at Okinawa and overseas was a bottle of booze. He said, that's the only thing I really wanted. And I think ultimately I respected his privacy. But I remember my mother saying somehow the war came up at a family function, just his grandmother and mother, and he had to leave the room and smoke a cigarette. I can guess at things that he saw, and this is complete conjecture. He was a complete pacifist, but he may have killed someone and seen it, because in most cases you never did. And that's what you have to do. There was a reunion of the 6th Marine Division Association in Philadelphia. They used to have hundreds who came back, hundreds of men and their wives. We had 7 returning vets this year. I'm a lineal descendant. Next year will be the last year. That'll be the 50th anniversary of the association, and that's it, because there are no vets left, which is incredibly poignant. And during the reunion, a wreath was thrown overboard by the vets on the USS New Jersey, which is anchored at Camden. And as I saw that wreath go into the water, I got choked up, as I'm sort of getting now. He was unimaginably brave to me. He would never categorize himself that way. All these men were unimaginably brave. They would never categorize themselves that way. I know if it was me, and they said, "All right, it's time to go. You got to disembark," I'd say, "You know what? I don't think I feel that great today. Why don't you guys go ahead, and I'll meet you later." But you know, they didn't. So that's a good question. So it does make me feel immensely proud. Immensely proud, because, of course, he went in the Marines because, typical my father, he said, you know, he was drafted by the Navy, and he said, I really don't want to die in a ship. So I guess he figured, what the hell, I'll die at the hands of a Japanese bayonet, which was an interesting kind of choice that he made. But fortunately, he came home safe.
Writing is hard. It can be very emotional. What characteristics would you say should pop out in a high school student to suggest that writing would be a good career for them?
You know, I'm asked the question a lot. It's become a very painful question because I don't have a good answer. I know that I benefited myself from being at the right place at the right time. I went to Penn. I graduated in 1976. Every newspaper, whether they were great, whether they were big, whether they were small, this was the era of Watergate. They all wanted to do in-depth reporting. They all wanted to do in-depth pieces. I applied to 307 newspapers for employment and got a job offer at 1. Well, maybe 2, but that was Casper, Wyoming, which I don't include. And the only reason I got a job offer there was because I almost was able to keep up with the managing editor drinking, who drank more than any man I've ever seen in my life. But the Ledger-Star was not a great paper, but it was hired a tremendous amount of talented people, and you were doing really thick stories. You were already at that point thinking about narrative, thinking about plot, thinking about momentum, thinking about pace, thinking about character development. The only thing I can suggest is he keeps writing, you have to write for the joy of it and reading. And try not to obsess too much on what's going to be my future, what's going to be my future, what's going to be my future. I know the students I have, many of whom are really brilliant, one of whom was here, who I saw. A lot of them worry frantically about their futures. It is not easy being a liberal arts major, and it's not easy at a place like Penn that is so driven by Wharton and sort of by the direction of having a career. But I do believe that there's a will, there's a way. If nothing else, he writes. It may not pay off in becoming a writer, but it will pay off in all sorts of wonderful ways, because the ability to articulate, the ability to express yourself is a joy and a pleasure, really, that few possess. And be willing to do anything to get any, opportunity. I would have gone to any newspaper in the 50 states, just to get a job. I didn't start at some place that was fancy. I actually got 2 Xerox rejection letters from the New York Times, just so I would get the point that they didn't want to hire me, but I guess I had the last laugh. And give him tons of love and support and attention. It's amazing to me how many writers remember some teacher they had, whether it's in elementary school, high school, or college, that had an enormous impact on how they became writers. And that's truly a beautiful, wondrous thing.
Is there a question up here? Oh, okay. Yes, front. All right, this could take a while. That is a hard job.
Could you talk a little bit about A Prayer for the City? And particularly, it seems like the Rendell administration was so open and willing to sort of have you be present for such a significant amount. And I'm just curious sort of did they have any misgivings about that? What did they expect to come from that?
I'm just curious. How many here have met Ed Rendell or know Ed Rendell? All right, well, if you know Ed Rendell, you'll know the answer to this question will not surprise you. Ed is a very impulsive man. His sidekick, so to speak, David Cohn, who's now the chairman of the board of the Penn Trustees, is not an impulsive man. People do things for a reason. People give access for a reason because they think they have a story to tell and they think it's going to be a good story. I had covered Ed when he had run for mayor in 1987, so we knew of each other. My Pulitzer story with 2 other reporters had been on the Philadelphia court system when Ed was DA, so there was respect. But as I asked Ed that, I said, why would you let me in? And he said, because there was no place to go but up, because Wilson Good had done such a terrible fucking job. There was not much we had to do to look better. And I think that was a lot of the calculus. And I remember Ed had won the primary, and then Frank Rizzo had died, so it was automatic that he was going to become mayor. And A Prayer for the City, of those who don't know, was about the first 4-year term of Ed Rendell, when Philadelphia was really on the skids and on its knees, and there were legitimate questions as to what would become of the city. It was broke. People were leaving in droves. There was a terrible drug problem. There was a terrible financial problem. The city was really on its hands and knees. And my idea was to spend 4 years inside the mayor's office, so to speak, inside the administration, to portray in human terms whether anyone could make a difference at this point. Ed was having a fundraiser in Chicago, and that's where I first approached him about this idea. I'd spoken to David, and David said, well, I think it's interesting, but you got to talk to Ed. And I was really, really nervous, and I thought, all right, if he gives me access, there are going to be all sorts of conditions. You can go here, you can't go here, you can do this, you can't do this. What I didn't know is that Ed takes a perverse pleasure in being perverse. So when I saw Ed, it was in the elevator. He said only one thing, and I think I'm trying to be accurate. He said, look, our biggest problem will be if people know who you are, they're going to lie. So we have to figure out how to get around that. And that was it. and said, "I'll see you when I see you."
How did you get around that?
I didn't lie. No, I didn't lie. If someone was a public official, if someone was meeting Ed as a public official, and Ed said you can be there at the meeting, I felt they are public officials, they represent us, that's fair game. Ed had a little couch in his office. Aides usually memorialize meetings because mayors forget what was said. So I didn't dress like this. I didn't wear any leather then. I would dress in a little suit and a little tie. My hair was neatly combed, and I would take notes on my legal pad, and they thought I was an aide. And I remember Henry Cisneros, who was then the Secretary of HUD. This was a really private meeting. And he looked at me and he pointed and he said, "Oh shit, I'm going to be discovered." And he said, "Not a word of this in the fucking press. Do you understand?" Seriously. I mean, seriously. I don't know if he said fucking, but. And I said, "That's fine," because I wasn't writing for a newspaper. I was just writing a book. But Ed would have me hide so I could overhear conversations. He would say if something happened, it was a pivotal meeting with the head of the union. No reporter had ever heard that, and he said, "All right, get on your knees and listen to the crack." And so when we went to the Cisneros meeting, he literally gave me his valise. So I really did look like him. He said, "Just shut up and follow me, okay?" He also obviously had confidence in himself. If you're going to spend 4 years with someone, there's no one better to spend it with. He is without a doubt the funniest person that I have ever encountered. I mean, he has a great sense of the absurd. He also has a volcanic temper. He's a complex man, and he and David made it lively and made it interesting. It was a slog. It was a hard book to do. I knew going in that it certainly would not have the success of Friday Night Lights, and whereas the constituency for Friday Night Lights, which was about high school football, really was anyone who had gone to high school, because they ended up identifying with the book in many ways. The constituency for a book about mayors is about 5 other big city mayors. and that was hard. I mean, there was a lot of depression and a lot of anxiety, but it was my best book. It took a lot out of me, but it was, I think, much more complex than Friday Night Lights. It didn't have the visceral feel of kids and high school and cheerleaders and sex and winning, and but it was a challenging book to do, to make it interesting, and I think, or I hope that I succeeded. Exactly.
One in the back there. And I think this is probably going to be the last one.
Hi, just what is it about high school that you think is universal, even with, Generation Z that's coming up now? Maybe there's very different attitudes about football and sports and gender that's coming in through I think, through the younger generations.
The problem is I have enough trouble speaking for me, much less speaking for Generation Z. I didn't even know there was a Generation Z. I do think high school has changed. I think gender issues have changed, what I think is great. I know I just read in the New York Times that participation in football is down 10%. You have to take that with a grain of salt. They didn't really get into it. I think most of that 10% is white, so football is increasingly becoming the province of African Americans and Hispanics, low income, which has problems all its own, because I think they're often sold a bill of goods and almost taken advantage of. I think Friday Night Lights, if it was written today, would be obviously different, because I do think high school has changed. On the other hand, it wasn't that long ago, but there was a high school football stadium built in Allen, Texas, for $70 million. And I forget that it was a suburb in Houston, which was built for $40 million. What would be interesting would be to actually go back to the high school that I wrote about and see to what degree it has changed. It was a very, very traditional high school. There was very, very much this very, very strong line between what men were supposed to do and what women were supposed to do, and women were definitely supposed to dumb down. And the question is, has that changed? They used to, when I did the book, they had this women's group called the Pepettes, and each Pepette was assigned a football player, and they really were geisha girls. I mean, they baked cookies, they baked cakes, they baked candies, they brought them gifts, and wink, wink, nod, nod. I think they were also there to perform sexual acts, That they finally got rid of as a result of the book. But to what degree it's changed beyond that, I really don't know.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone. We will have a reception after this. Buzz will be signing books, and you're welcome to buy them. And thanks so much. And thank you again, Writers House.